carnal, dice mi gente, la raza está abajo y tú estás indiferente. Prefieres cerrar los ojos, no vi nada. Estabas ocupado por andar en la tomada. Te gusta tirar el cruising todo el día, buscando a las mujeres como si el mundo acabaría. Pero no sabías que tú podías continuar tu educación para superarte en la vida. Hermano joven, levanta tu frente y siente el orgullo de ser un descendiente de los aztecas, los incas y los mayas. Ayúdame a pelear y vencer esta...
Enemy troops swore there would be no Texas, but 186 Texans didn't hear. And as long as history shall honor courage, men will remember the Alamo. Remember John Wayne as Davy Crockett, who came to the Alamo a hero and stayed to become a legend.
You must be Jim Bowie.
Remember Richard Widmark as Jim Bowie, willing his name to a weapon and his life to a cause. Remember Lawrence Harvey as Colonel in act of defiance into a monument of courage.
Somewhere around here, Sam Houston is trying to organize an army. And right in between is the Alamo.
Frankie Avalon as Smitty, his first battle, and in his hands, the last hope for Texas. Richard Boone as General Sam Houston. Every minute of time he fought was another minute in the life of Texas. Be there at the Alamo. Remember it.
Well, you ain't gonna try to defend this broken-down church against 7,000 battle-hard troops.
Remember it.
Republic. I like the sound of the word. Means people can live free, talk free.
Remember it. Once again, its greatness shouts, remember. Out of this siege that lasted 13 days and nights comes a saga. If you're seeing it for the first time, or look forward to seeing it again, you'll know why everyone remembers the Alamo. Be there at the Alamo.
Antonio Diaz with your program of Mestizo Experience. We're in the month of June 2022. And as you can see, I'm still wearing a mask. So we're still in the COVID era. Como todos saben, este programa es bilingüe, trilingüe cuando hablo también náhuatl. Todavía estamos en el tiempo del virus, por eso ven con la máscara, aunque el comercio dice que ya se acabó, no se ha acabado, solo que sigan cuidándose. Programa de Mestizo Experience, mes de junio. Hoy me da gran placer tener un invitado que ha sido parte del gobierno de aquí de San Antonio, ha sido parte de nuestra comunidad como activista, como educador. Es algo que es parte de lo que la hace a San Antonio lo que es. Today, I have the great pleasure of having an ex-city councilman, former city councilman, activist, educator. He is part of the fabric of our community of San Antonio. He makes what San Antonio is to be San Antonio. And he's also an author. And we're here to talk about his book, my friend, Mario Salas.
Good. Glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, Mario, as I said, let me take this off. As you all know, aware, just to remind you, we're still in time COVID, but it's a lot more relaxed. Mario's going to tell us about his book, The Alamo. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Well, the title is going to make a few people upset, but that's okay. That's the way I wrote it. The title of the book is The Alamo, A Cradle of Lies, Slavery, and White Supremacy. And what I attempted to do in this book is to talk about those very things. That when Anglo settlers came here from the slave-owning states, and that's the thing that people need to remember, They came from the slave-owning states where, in those days, the mark of freedom was if you had white skin. That was the mark of freedom. If you were a white person, you were free. If you were not a white person, you were either marginalized, oppressed, or enslaved. And so this is the kind of people that came here with those kinds of thoughts in their mind. And I know for a fact that when they did come here, they weren't just coming here because of the cotton industry. People have to keep in mind that cotton was a big deal back at that time, and it was blowing up as a marketable commodity. So they knew they could get rich by ripping away Mexican land to form what's now called Texas. And they did just that. They brought their slaves here. Moses Austin, the father of Stephen F. Austin, we all know what Austin, Texas is at, named after Stephen F. Austin. The original 300 settlers brought with them approximately 300 to 400 slaves into the San Antonio area and into Texas as well as a whole. And it kept on going. And despite the fact that Mexico was beginning to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment, which was taking place in Europe, meaning kings and monarchs were being overthrown, there was more of an emphasis on some form of democracy, even though it was tainted with white supremacy. There was still an emphasis on democracy. So Mexico was beginning to shift in that direction, which would have made them directly at odds with the slave owners coming into Texas. And that would include Davy Crockett, that would include Jim Bowie, William B. Travis, one of the worst, Sam Houston, another one, later on, the son of Moses Austin, Stephen F. Austin, Burnett. I mean, I could go on and name them one after the another. Fannin, one after. They were all pro-slavery men who didn't think black people were human at all, hated Mexican Americans. As a matter of fact, one of Sam Houston's famous quotes was that, and I quote his quote, this is what he said, I'm not saying this, that the sturdy men of the North, quote, should never mix with the phlegm of the Mexican. And you know what phlegm is, it's snot. Mm-hmm. And that's a direct quote from Sam Houston. So for somebody to say Sam Houston wasn't a racist is just unbelievable. The historical record shows he was. He owned 12 slaves in addition to that. He hated Native Americans unless they were Native Americans that supported Andrew Jackson's war of extermination against Native people. Then Sam Houston liked them. And that happens with every oppressed group. You always find people who sell out their own folks. So, but this is an important thing to understand. And of course, Antonio, we all grew up with these lies, one lie after another. We grew up with that crazy movie, John Wayne's Alamo movie. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absurd. Never happened that way. And let me put it to you this way. Dr. Philip Tucker, another very famous professor, he did a real book called, the title of his book is provocative too. It's called Exodus from the Alamo, The Anatomy of the Last Stand Myth. And what he says in there was no real last stand because 120 of them ran out of the eastern and southern walls and were killed by Santa Anna's black soldiers, whose name was Los Morenos Libres de Veracruz, the free blacks of Veracruz. And you can imagine, I mean, think about that a minute. You're a white slave owner, you think blacks are inferior, you think Native people are inferior, you think Mexicans are inferior, and all of a sudden you look out on the other side of the walls of the Alamo, and there's all kinds of very dark-skinned people walking around fully armed, which was something they would not have seen in the slave-owning states, because it was against the law for any black person to own a gun or even be seen with one. Automatic death sentence in most cases. So the fighting lasted inside the walls about 20 minutes. That was it. It happened between 3 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the morning. It took a longer amount of time to kill those who ran, about 2.5 hours. But they were killed right where, any of you been to downtown San Antonio and have maybe ate at Denny's restaurant or gone to River Center Mall? That's where most of them were killed. They ran, and that's where they died at. And they were killed mostly by Santa Anna's black Mexican soldiers. called the Free Blacks of Veracruz. That took about 2.5 hours. It was all over by 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning.
So see, a lot of people don't realize that Mexico had banned slavery after their, like you said, they were moving towards a more democratic republic type of government, and they had broken away from Spain from 1810 to 1821, and the second president of Mexico at that from becoming a monarchy to a republic was Guerrero.
Correct.
And being that he was of indigenous blood and African blood.
Yeah, Afro-Mestizo, you might say, Afro-Indio.
Yeah, he's the one that really moved this, even though he was assassinated over this issue. It stuck.
Yep.
And when they were trying to make the white immigrants moving into the Southwest, which was Texas, Coahuila, bringing slaves over here, they gave them a time limit that they had to free everybody.
Right.
And that's what led to the revolution, the rebellion of these white immigrants to keep their slaves and to keep not recognizing indigenous people such as Comanches, Apaches, whatever had moved in from the 1500s on into this area, to keep calling them savages and non-human.
That's right.
To dispossess them of any ownership of land, or like you're saying, even owning weapons to be able to defend their land rights and all this. A lot of people don't understand this, Mario.
Yeah, they don't. And you mentioned 1829. That was the year that Guerrero, Vicente Guerrero, outlawed slavery, abolished slavery in Mexico. And this is way before Abraham Lincoln. This happened a long time before Abraham Lincoln. And there was a super progressive mood that was put in place. And when the slave owners, the Anglo settlers, the slave owners, got word that slavery was being abolished, well, you imagine, they went ballistic. This means war, because they came here to get wealthy. They came here to get wealthy. How could you get wealthy coming here? Well, Mexico was either giving away free land or selling it from, at one point, 6 cents an acre, if you could believe that, or later on 12 cents an acre. So all you had to do was buy, a small spread, have a few slaves to work it, and then sell your cotton to England by shipping it down to the coast, down to Corpus or Galveston, shipping it down there and then having it transported. So you could become wealthy overnight using slave labor. And so slavery, owning human beings, was the American dream of that time. So you had all these Anglo immigrants leaving Tennessee and Virginia and Kentucky and those places with the idea in mind that they could become wealthy. And I don't know why people think that that's such a great thing. The most laziest people in the world were plantation owners. They're not going to pick their own cotton. They're not going to pick their own tobacco. They're going to get other people to do it while they're sitting on the porch eating sweet chicken dinners. So that they needed slave labor in order to become wealthy. And Mexico opposed this. They went ballistic when Mexico actually did that. So, and the stories that we grew up with, oh my God, nothing is mentioned of that. Nothing is mentioned that Bowie brought at least 8 slaves with him into San Antonio, having purchased them from John Lafitte, the pirate, at Galveston Island. Nothing is mentioned that when the war against Spain, which really was a war against colonialism, that actually Simón Bolívar went to Haiti. He's the liberator of South America, but he was able to go to Haiti. The Haitians, a black country, helped him because he had to leave Venezuela, Colombia for a time. They helped him they gave him ships, they gave him arms to get back into the fight. And their only demand, if it even was that, or request, was everywhere you go, liberate slaves. So what is unknown to many people, around 1812, I want to say, maybe 1814, someone in there, 200 French-speaking troops landed at Galveston Island to fight with the revolutionaries against Spain. That's never mentioned. There is some record to indicate that some of them may have made it to the Battle of Medina, which was against the Spaniards. These would have been black, French-speaking troops. That's never mentioned. Crockett left, of course, Tennessee. He owed people money. They said it was a warrant for his arrest. He was a slave owner. Bowie was a slave owner, as I mentioned. Sam Houston, a slave owner. And probably William Barrett Travis was, I don't know, I considered him the worst of the lot. When Mexico outlawed slavery, they came up with a scheme. They came up with a plot. They always come up with plots. And the plot was, let's just go to Mexico and tell them we're going to change the status of these enslaved people to indentured servants. And they might accept that because they have like a system similar to that in Mexico. But what we're not going to tell them is, it's not for 7 years. It's for 99 years. And William Travis concocted this scheme on the Louisiana side of the border, took it across, and that's what he presented to Stephen F. Austin at one point, to go to Mexico City to present this plot. Well, Mexico fell for it initially until Santa Anna read the fine print. And we all know about reading the fine print. He knew he'd been hoodwinked, and this meant war. So they were all the time trying to come up with plots and schemes to make Texas a slave empire, is what they ultimately were trying to do. And so the story of the Alamo, how can you carry the banner of freedom in one hand and the flag of slavery in the other? And this is what they were doing, but we were told all kinds of stories. People who were no good, despicable, criminal, slave owners were turned into heroes based upon these false stories that they told us for all these years.
And we'll be seeing a clip from that John Wayne movie during the beginning of the program. And the reason for that is to show you what we used to see as children in our generation. Yeah. And before that, right, what was written, what was made public was that they were heroes, not any mention of being slave owners, not any mention of all this white supremacy, because here in San Antonio, I'm trying to remember the year, I was trying to get it before I got here, the year that the KKK marched through downtown right here by City Hall.
Right.
It was in the 1920s. So it was very, very pervasive. It was, like I say, now I see people such as yourself making up the fabric of San Antonio. Back in those days, they were the fabric. And it was the segregation of San Antonio was very, very, it's still very economically segregated, but back then it was racially segregated. And in some areas, black people were not allowed into certain areas of the city. Mexicans were not allowed, even though this was Mexico, into certain areas of the city. And I don't know how many of you, if you're watching this program, really understand the history of the United States and of our area locally, which I think is to write such a book and to have been, I guess, part of the government, and you're still in there. You're not gone. And so we're trying to bring this change and influence you, the future, to think. And instead of going with this craziness of a John Wayne movie and what was instilled in us, for you to be able to be an actual thinker, read Mario's book and find out some facts. And also you have quotes from different activists and so forth that are also local, right?
Yeah, George Cisneros, who's the brother of Henry Cisneros' brother, used to be the mayor of San Antonio. He wrote a wonderful, almost comical blurb for me. I had several blurbs. County Commissioner Tommy Calvert wrote a blurb too.
What was George? Say George.
Well, George he's a card. Here's what he said. When historians and political scientists of the future look back towards our current times, and during their research activities, they enter the key words smart, he's talking about me now, smart, strategic, cunning, provocative, irritating, persistent, unwavering, stubborn, he's got that right, unfazed, deliberate, significant, defiant, sensitive, thought-provoking, insightful, and a gentleman, the name and life of Mario Salas will surface to the top of their list. that was
quote.
especially the irritating and stubborn part.
That's a lie, right?
He has that. Oh, yeah, right. That's right. So, but that's very important. And you know, look, over the years, all this stuff is connected too. It's not separate subjects. We removed that Confederate statue of Travis Park. We got that Columbus statue out of Columbus Park, and I just want to say, Mr. Diaz led that charge in many ways. The indigenous community led that charge, but he was at the front of it as well. And so that's a very important. I do have a quote in there related to Mr. Diaz, your host on the show here, and I'd just like to read you a little bit of that. Those slaves that did not produce their quota of gold were tortured or their hands or feet amputated. Others were whipped to death. Columbus wanted to gather as much gold as possible to satisfy the greed of Isabella and Ferdinand in the Catholic Church. Eventually, when the gold fever diminished, silver mining thrived by working the native people to death. His soldiers were also given permission to slice the skin of indigenous people in order to test the effectiveness of their weapons. Those attempting to leave the mines were hunted down with dogs and torn to pieces. Others were simply hanged, burned to death, or tortured. Columbus was a psychotic killer, and even some of his own kind rebelled against his brutality. Moreover, native people died from the germs brought from Europe. This was often done on purpose, as germ warfare was instrumental in the killing off of entire populations and then replacing native people with African slaves. This is why statues of Columbus are being removed across the globe or destroyed. The statue of Columbus was removed in San Antonio thanks to the Native American people and their allies and the work of indigenous leader Antonio Diaz.
Wow.
So we need to look at the whole picture.
I didn't. You really. Okay.
So it's not just the Alamo. It's the hell that Native Americans went through. It's the hell slaves went through. It's the hell that these racists brought into Mexican Texas to steal their land. They don't want to tell their story what should be told. Well, we're going to tell it whether they like it or not. And look, I never tell stories based. This is not me saying this. This is what, as I mentioned the Sam Houston quote, this is what they said in their own words. So you can't use that right-wing argument about presentism. I'm not saying this out of my mouth. I'm telling you what they said. The worst day that could have ever existed for indigenous people, black people in Texas was the Battle of San Jacinto. The worst day in their life because slavery was reintroduced. They demanded that Mexico return slaves, although Mexico refused. They demanded that slaves be returned to them. And when they wrote the Texas Constitution, right after that, in the very first few articles, it says no free black people could stay here unless you had some kind of special permission. And the only special permission they gave was to Uncle Tom's, who fought with them. Now, they don't mind holding them up in some kind of glorious way. They do that all the time. You can find Uncle Tom's in every ethnic group. That's the game they played. The proof of the pudding, you know, when Grandma bakes a pie, is the taste. The proof of the pudding that racism was the driver behind Texas independence was the fact that in their own constitution, right after they defeated Mexico, they enslaved slavery as an institution.
I've brought that up several times during city council meeting and commissioner's court to point out that we need change, right? Because, I mean, glorifying the past the way that it's done here, such as the fiesta that goes on in March to recognize the Battle of San Jacinto.
Right. As
you're bringing up now, that's where Sam Houston and other forces defeated Santa Anna and the Mexican forces. The Alamo was a defeat, so they can't celebrate that outright, but they do it. They do it underhandedly by celebrating that and saying, "No, we're not celebrating that battle. We're celebrating the cradle of
the so-called cradle of liberty, but
Yeah.
really is the cradle of slavery.
And they've got our people out there spending money, drinking, and having a good time. And
They don't know the history, Antonio. They don't know the history.
I mean, I'm not against making money. I'm not against people having a good time. But let's do it for actual good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, such as let's celebrate even Juneteenth, was finally what it took 2 extra years to get from Abraham Lincoln to Galveston.
To Galveston.
You know.
Let me tell you two stories real quick about those two events. The Battle of San Jacinto, they often claim it took 18 minutes. That's false, number one. It didn't take 18 minutes. They made that up. The Battle of the Alamo had nothing to do with the Battle of Thermopylae. Remember when they talk about the 300 Spartans?
Right.
They never talk about the 6,000 barbarians that fought with the 300 on the last day of the Battle of Thermopylae. So it wasn't 300, it was 6,300. So they erased the other people because they weren't Spartans. At San Jacinto, the reason why Santana lost that battle, because his well-trained troops were on the road looking for Sam Houston. They got outflanked, and then Sam Houston went around them. What was left at San Jacinto was young boys to fight what little they could. So they weren't going up against the crack troops that Santana had. Those well-trained troops, well-experienced troops, they were on the road looking for Sam Houston. They weren't at San Jacinto. So they don't tell that story. So it was easy to defeat these young boys who were really there left with Santana. He made a mistake. He shouldn't have done that, but he did. And that's what left him vulnerable to an attack. They don't tell that story.
They're not going to tell the truth. So I'm glad that you also put it in writing, even though you've been advocating and educating for years and years. And but now you got it in writing in a book, and we'll let people know where you're going to be, as you've already had some book signings and where some future ones will be. Mario, we have less than 3 minutes, about 2.5 minutes left of this program. Anything else that you want to say? Because you've said some, I'm pretty sure, earth-shaking statements already to some people that don't like to hear these sorts of things. But anything else?
There's so much. There's 600 pages in this book, so there's quite a bit to read, and I try to make parallels. I show connections between the past and how the past affects the present and the future. And so I include these other things. I include the Civil War. I include the fact that Texas decided to secede from the United States, and they say themselves, this is not me saying it, the slave owners themselves said the Civil War was about slavery. And they're always trying to make the argument that professors say this and that it's they the ones who are saying it. No, the slave owners said that themselves. Stephen F. Austin said that the Anglo-American race, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically what he said was fighting against a mongrel, savage, Indian, part African race, Mexicans. That's how he described the indigenous people of Mexico. So these racist statements, I mean, there's no doubt about it, they were all racist. All of the Alamo heroes, racist, slave owners, no good people. And you can't say everybody believed in slavery at that time. That's just not true. Millions of people didn't believe in slavery, right. But they aren't the ones who control society. The ones who control society were those bad guys.
Pretty much kind of like today, huh? We still have a few of those that were back then that are ultra rich, still controlling a lot of what the government does.
Exactly.
So, and the millions of us that are over here, hey, why are things still the same and years upon years? Because those hands are still controlling.
They poison democracy with money and with racism, both.
Because it's an important book.
Well, thank
Friend.
you. And I present you with the book. It's all yours.
La Socamati.
Thank you.
¿Qué onda, carnal? Dice mi gente, la raza está abajo y tú estás indiferente. Prefieres cerrar los ojos, no vi nada. Estabas ocupado por andar en la tomada. Te gusta tirar el cruising todo el día, buscando a las mujeres como si el mundo acabaría. Pero no sabías que tú podías continuar tu educación para superarte en la vida. Hermano joven, levanta tu frente y siente el orgullo de ser un descendiente de los aztecas, los incas y los mayas. Ayúdame a pelear y